I never believed in ghosts or haunted places, not until that cold December night at the old Greystone train station. I was just passing through, hoping to catch a late-night train to visit my grandmother in the countryside. The station had a reputation, though. Locals called it Whispering Junction, claiming it was cursed. They said you could hear voices late at night, voices that didn't belong to anyone alive. I thought it was just one of those urban legends people tell to spice up their otherwise dull lives. When I arrived, the place was eerily quiet, too quiet. The usual hum of conversation, the shuffle of feet, and the occasional announcement were absent. Instead, an oppressive silence hung in the air, broken only by the faint creaking of the old wooden benches. The station's lights flickered sporadically, casting distorted shadows on the cracked tiles. I approached the ticket counter, but there was no one there. Just an old brass bell and a sign that read, "Back in 10 minutes." I rang the bell once. It echoed unnaturally, reverberating through the empty hall. That's when I noticed it. A faint whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind sneaking through the station's broken windows, but then I heard it again, clearer this time. It wasn't just a sound, it was a voice. A woman's voice, soft and sorrowful, repeating the same phrase over and over. "Don't board the train, and please don't board the train." I turned around sharply, expecting to see someone behind me, but the station was still deserted. My heart began to race, and for the first time I felt a chill creep up my spine. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a trick of my imagination. I checked the schedule board, hoping to distract myself. My train was delayed by an hour. Great. As I made my way to one of the benches, something caught my eye. A figure standing at the far end of the platform. It was a woman in an old-fashioned dress, her back turned to me. She seemed out of place, like she belonged to another era. For a moment, I hesitated, unsure if I should call out to her. But before I could decide, she turned her head slightly, just enough for me to see her profile. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes, there was something wrong with her eyes. They were empty, devoid of life, like two dark voids staring into nothingness. I froze, unable to look away. Then, in a blink, she was gone. No sound, no movement, just gone. My hands started trembling, and the air seemed heavier, as if the entire station were holding its breath. And then the whispering began again. This time it wasn't just one voice, it was many. I wasn't alone anymore. I sat frozen on the cold wooden bench, my mind racing to make sense of what I'd just seen. The whispering voices grew louder, swirling around me like an unseen crowd. I clutched my bag tightly, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe the stress of traveling alone was messing with me, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. The station felt alive in the worst way possible. The flickering lights seemed to pulse in rhythm with the whispers, and the air carried an unnatural chill that seeped into my bones. I checked the time on my phone. Only 5 minutes had passed since I sat down, but it felt like hours. Suddenly, I heard the sound of footsteps echoing across the platform. They weren't hurried or frantic, but deliberate, as if someone or something was pacing back and forth. I whipped my head toward the source of the sound, but the platform was empty. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was deafening. I felt a bead of sweat roll down my temple despite the freezing air. Just then, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. A man was sitting on the bench across from me, or at least I thought it was a man. He was hunched over, wearing a long coat and an old-fashioned hat that cast a shadow over his face. I hadn't seen him walk in, and I didn't hear him sit down. He was just there. "Excuse me," I said cautiously. "Do you know if the train is still coming?" The man didn't respond. He didn't even move. I felt a wave of unease wash over me. His stillness wasn't normal. It was unnatural, almost like he wasn't breathing. Sir? I tried again, my voice barely above a whisper. Slowly, he turned his head toward me, and I gasped. His face was pale and sunken, like someone who hadn't seen sunlight in decades. His eyes were milky white, unfocused yet piercing. But it was his expression that unsettled me the most. He was smiling. Not a warm or friendly smile, but something sinister, like he knew something I didn't. Before I could react, he raised a bony finger and pointed behind me. My blood ran cold. I didn't want to look, but something compelled me to. Turning slowly, I saw what he was pointing at. A figure standing in the middle of the tracks. It was the woman I'd seen earlier, the one in the old-fashioned dress. This time I could see her clearly. Her dress was torn and stained, and her hair hung in damp, tangled strands. She stood motionless, staring directly at me with those same hollow eyes. And then she moved. Not like a person, but in quick, jerky motions, as if she were a marionette being yanked by invisible strings. She tilted her head to one side, her neck bending at an unnatural angle, and then she raised her hand to wave at me. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. When I turned to look at the man on the bench, he was gone. Panic surged through me, and I sprinted toward the ticket counter, desperate to find someone, anyone, who could explain what was happening. But the counter was still empty. The "back in 10 minutes" sign mocked me, swinging gently as if someone had just brushed past it. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent now, mingling with faint laughter that sent shivers down my spine. I turned around, scanning the station, but it was still empty, or so I thought. Out of the shadows emerged another figure, then another, and another. They came from all directions, their faces pale and lifeless, their movements slow and deliberate. Each one of them stared at me, their hollow eyes filled with a silent accusation. I backed up against the wall, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear myself think. They didn't speak, but I could feel their presence pressing down on me, suffocating and inescapable. Then, as if on cue, the station's announcement system crackled to life. A distorted voice echoed through the hall. "Next train arriving in 5 minutes. Please stay clear of the tracks." The figures began to retreat, fading into the shadows as quickly as they had appeared. For a moment I thought it was over, that maybe, just maybe, I could escape whatever nightmare I had stumbled into. But then I noticed the woman on the tracks again. She hadn't moved, but now she was pointing at the clock tower above the station. I followed her gaze and froze. The hands of the clock weren't moving. They were stuck at 12:03, the exact time I had arrived. And that's when I realized time wasn't moving here, and neither was I. As I stood there staring at the frozen hands of the clock, a terrifying thought began to form in my mind. What if I wasn't supposed to leave this station? What if I was trapped here, just like the voices, the figures, and the shadows? I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. There had to be an explanation, some logical reason for all of this. Maybe the clock was broken. Maybe the woman and the man were just deranged drifters playing tricks on me. But as much as I tried to convince myself, the chill in the air and the oppressive feeling in my chest refused to let me believe it. Determined to find answers, I decided to explore the station further. The platform extended into darkness on both ends, but there was a small hallway marked Station Master's Office. If there was any place that could hold a clue, that had to be it. The hallway was narrow and dimly lit, the walls peeling with age and neglect. The air smelled of mildew and something faintly metallic, like rust or blood. As I reached the door to the office, I noticed something strange. Scratch marks on the wooden surface, as though someone, or something, had been clawing to get in. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open. The room was small and cluttered, filled with dusty ledgers, faded photographs, and an old desk. On the wall hung a large map of the rail lines, with Greystone Station circled in red. Beneath the circle, someone had scrawled the words, "Never forget, never forgive." My stomach churned as I scanned the desk. Among the papers was an old newspaper clipping, yellowed with age. The headline read, "Train number 117 tragedy, 56 dead in devastating crash near Greystone Station." The article detailed a horrific accident that had occurred nearly a century ago. A passenger train, running late on a stormy night, had derailed just a mile from the station. The survivors claimed that the train had been stopped by a signalman warning of danger ahead, but no record of such a signalman existed. Worse yet, the bodies of several passengers were never recovered. The wreckage had been cleared, but the locals believed the souls of the victims still lingered, waiting for the train that would never come. I shivered as I read further. One of the passengers mentioned was a young woman named Eleanor Grace, a name that sounded eerily familiar. I flipped to another photograph pinned to the board, and my breath caught in my throat. It was her, the woman I'd seen on the tracks. Beneath her name was a chilling note. Eleanor Grace, 24 years old, last seen waving to passengers before disappearing into the woods. Body never found. The room seemed to grow colder as I pieced it together. Eleanor wasn't just another passenger. She had been trying to warn them. But no one listened, and now her spirit was trapped here, bound to the station where it all began. As I stood there, the whispers returned, louder and more desperate. They weren't just voices, they were pleas. I turned to leave the office, but the door slammed shut behind me and I felt a presence in the room. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice shaking. The whisper stopped, and for a moment there was only silence. Then a single, clear voice broke through. A man's voice, deep and mournful. "You shouldn't have come here." I spun around, but there was no one there. The air grew heavier, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move, stretching toward me like living things. The map on the wall began to bleed, the red ink of the circle around Greystone Station spreading across the page. Desperate to escape, I lunged for the door and forced it open. The hallway outside was no longer empty. Figures crowded the space, their faces pale and distorted, their eyes filled with sorrow and anger. They didn't move, but I could feel their collective gaze boring into me. I ran back to the platform, my heart pounding. The station felt even more suffocating now, as if the walls themselves were closing in. The clock still read 12:03, but I could hear the faint sound of a train approaching. The woman on the tracks was still there, her figure illuminated by the flickering lights. This time she wasn't alone. A dozen shadowy figures stood with her, their forms flickering like dying flames. The train's horn blared louder and closer, but something about the sound was off. It wasn't mechanical. It was almost human, like a wail of anguish echoing through the night. As the train emerged from the darkness, my blood ran cold. It wasn't a normal train. The carriages were blackened and charred, their windows shattered, and flames flickered faintly along the edges. The number 117 was etched into the side, glowing faintly like a brand. The train screeched to a halt in front of the platform, and the doors creaked open. Inside, there was nothing but darkness. I didn't know what terrified me more, the thought of boarding that train or the possibility that I didn't have a choice. The train stood before me, motionless yet alive, exhaling a cold mist that crept across the platform. Its doors were wide open, beckoning me into the black void within. The whispers around me grew louder, merging into a cacophony of voices, pleading, warning, crying. I took a step back, my instincts screaming at me to run, but my feet felt like they were rooted to the ground. From the corner of my eye, I saw the woman, Eleanor, still standing on the tracks. This time, she wasn't pointing or moving. She simply stared at me, her hollow eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. Was it sorrow? Or perhaps a silent plea? The train's horn blared again, shattering my thoughts. The figures I had seen earlier began to emerge from the shadows, slowly approaching the platform. Their faces were clearer now, pale, gaunt, and etched with expressions of pain and longing. They weren't just ghosts. They were the passengers of train 117. I tried to speak, but no words came out. The closest figure, A man in a soot-streaked suit raised his hand and pointed toward the train. His lips didn't move, but I heard his voice clearly in my head. "You must board. Only then will it end." My heart pounded as I shook my head. "No," I whispered. "I can't." Eleanor stepped forward, her figure becoming more distinct with every step. She moved onto the platform, her tattered dress swaying as if caught in a breeze I couldn't feel. She stopped a few feet away from me, her gaze locking with mine. "Please," she said, her voice soft but echoing in the stillness. "You must stop running. It's the only way." I didn't understand. Stop running? From what? From them? From myself? Before I could ask, the platform began to shift. The tiles beneath my feet cracked and crumbled, and the entire station seemed to dissolve into darkness. Suddenly, I was standing in the middle of the tracks, the train towering over me like a shadowed behemoth. The figures surrounded me now, their whispers forming words. "Join us. Set us free." Eleanor stepped closer, her face filled with a mixture of compassion and sadness. "You were chosen to see this, to feel this," she said. "The living can never truly understand the weight we bear. But you can help us find peace." Tears welled up in my eyes as I struggled to comprehend. But how? What can I do? She extended her hand toward me, and for a moment I hesitated. Her touch felt cold, but not hostile, like a breeze on a winter morning. She guided me toward the open door of the train, and as I stepped closer, the shadows inside seemed to part, revealing rows of empty seats. "Will I come back?" I asked, my voice trembling. Eleanor's expression softened. "You will, but only if you're willing to face the truth." With a deep breath, I stepped onto the train. The doors hissed shut behind me and the darkness swallowed everything. For a moment there was silence, complete and absolute. Then the train began to move, its wheels screeching against the rails as it plunged into the void. Inside, the air was heavy, and the seats were filled, not with passengers, but with memories. Flickering images surrounded me, of laughter, tears, love, and loss. It was as if the train carried the collective pain of those who had perished. Eleanor appeared beside me, her voice calm and steady. "This is what binds us here. The pain of unfinished stories, of lives cut short. We relive it over and over, unable to let go." The train slowed, and a door opened at the far end of the carriage. Beyond it was a light, warm, inviting, and radiant. Eleanor smiled faintly. "You've given us the courage to move forward." "Thank you." The figures I had seen before began to emerge, one by one, stepping into the light. Their faces, once twisted with pain, now looked serene. I watched as they disappeared, their whispers fading into silence. Finally, Eleanor turned to me. "It's time for you to go back. Tell our story. Help others remember." Before I could respond, the light enveloped me, and I felt myself being pulled away. When I opened my eyes, I was back on the platform. The station was empty and the clock was ticking again. The train was gone, and so were the whispers. All that remained was an overwhelming sense of peace, and a single piece of paper clutched in my hand. It was an old train ticket, marked with the number 117 and the words, "One-way journey. Peace." I stood there staring at the ticket, knowing my life would never be the same. Some stories need to be told, not for the living, but for those who can no longer speak. And as I left Greystone Station, I vowed to keep my promise, to remember, to honor, and to never forget. Introduction and setting the scene, first segment. I've always believed that stories about haunted places were just exaggerated tales meant to scare kids or entertain thrill seekers. That was until I was assigned to work the graveyard shift at the old Ravenmore train station, a place whispered about in hushed tones, even during daylight hours. Ravenmore wasn't just any station. It stood isolated, surrounded by thick forests on one side and an endless stretch of foggy marshes on the other. The architecture was a blend of Victorian elegance and eerie abandonment. The towering iron arches and cracked stained glass windows gave it a hauntingly beautiful yet unsettling appearance. The kind of place that seemed to breathe history, secrets, and something darker. The station had been decommissioned decades ago, its tracks largely unused except for the occasional freight train. Yet, for reasons I couldn't comprehend, the company still maintained a skeleton staff. That's how I ended up there, alone, tasked with monitoring the place from midnight until dawn. It was supposed to be a quiet shift. Easy money, they said, but no one mentioned the unsettling silence or the strange events that would unfold. The first time I stepped onto the platform, a chill ran down my spine. Not the kind of chill from cold air, but a deeper primal feeling, like the station itself was watching me. The platform stretched endlessly in both directions, dimly lit by flickering lanterns that hung precariously from rusting posts. Beyond the tracks lay an abyss of darkness, where the faint outline of the marshes blurred with the horizon. Inside, the waiting area was a snapshot of the past, frozen in time. Dust-covered benches, a grand clock that had stopped ticking at exactly 3:07, and faded posters advertising long-forgotten destinations. The ticket booth, encased in glass, still held an old yellowed ledger and a broken ink pen. It was as if the people who once bustled through this station had vanished mid-step, leaving behind only their absence. I settled into the small control room, a cramped space filled with outdated equipment. The only sound was the soft hum of the ancient radio and the occasional creak of the building. Hours passed uneventfully until I heard it, the unmistakable echo of footsteps. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. After all, who would be wandering a closed station at this hour? But the sound persisted, deliberate and steady, as if someone was pacing the platform just outside. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped out cautiously, the beam cutting through the misty air. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding foreign in the emptiness. No reply. The footsteps stopped. The silence was deafening, heavier than before. Just as I turned to go back inside, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye, a shadow moving at the far end of the platform. It was quick, almost too quick, but unmistakable. Someone or something was there. A sense of unease settled over me, but I told myself it was probably just an animal or the play of light and shadows. Yet deep down, I knew that wasn't true. There was an unnatural stillness now, as if the station itself was holding its breath. The rest of the night passed with little incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. And then, as I was locking up just before dawn, I noticed something chilling. The clock inside the waiting room, the one frozen at 3:07 for who knows how many years, had moved. It now read 3:13. And that's when I realized Ravenmore was far more than just a decrepit old train station. Something else lingered here. Something waiting. The next night, I returned to Ravenmore train station, feeling a strange pull to the place despite the unease of the previous shift. It was as though the station itself had taken root in my mind, whispering its secrets just out of reach. I convinced myself that last night's events were nothing more than exhaustion playing tricks on me. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. It didn't take long for things to escalate. The first hour passed in relative silence. I busied myself with a half-hearted attempt to clean the control room, though my eyes kept drifting toward the station monitors. The ancient CCV system barely worked, showing grainy black-and-white images of the platforms and waiting area. As I scanned the screens, my stomach tightened. There, on Platform 2, stood a figure. It was hard to make out any details, but the person appeared to be dressed in old-fashioned clothing, a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat. They stood perfectly still, facing away from the camera. Maybe it's just a trespasser, I thought, though my voice trembled even in my head. Grabbing my flashlight and the station's old two-way radio, I headed toward the platform. The air felt heavier as I approached. The flickering lanterns cast eerie shadows that danced along the cracked walls, and every step echoed unnaturally loud in the empty station. When I reached platform 2, there was no one there. The figure had vanished, yet I could still feel their presence, a lingering tension in the air. I shone my flashlight across the platform, sweeping the beam over empty benches and rusted railings. Nothing. As I turned to head back, I noticed something on the ground, a trail of wet footprints leading away from the platform edge. The strange thing was, the footprints didn't look human. They were too large and misshapen, with claw-like impressions at the tips. The trail led toward the old waiting room. Against every instinct screaming at me to leave, I followed the prints. The waiting room was colder than usual, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones. My flashlight flickered as I stepped inside, casting distorted shadows on the walls. The footprints ended abruptly in the center of the room. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, yet unmistakably real. "Help me." I froze, my heart hammering against my chest. The voice was fragile, desperate, and it came from the direction of the ticket booth. Slowly, I turned the flashlight toward it. Behind the cracked glass of the booth, I saw her. A woman, her face pale and sunken, stared back at me with hollow eyes. Her clothes were soaked as though she had just climbed out of a river, and her hair hung in wet strands around her face. But the most disturbing part was her expression, a mix of sorrow and something far darker. Before I could say or do anything, she vanished. One blink, and she was gone, leaving only an icy chill in her place. Shaken, I stumbled back into the control room, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands trembled as I adjusted the CCTV monitors, hoping to find some logical explanation for what I'd seen. But the screens offered none. Instead, they showed something far worse. On the grainy footage of Platform 2, more figures began to appear. One by one, they emerged from the shadows, men, women, even children, all dressed in clothing from different eras. They stood silently, their faces obscured, as if waiting for a train that would never come. Then, as I watched in horror, they began to turn, slowly, their heads twisted toward the camera, their hollow eyes staring directly at me. The radio crackled to life beside me, its static filling the room. A distorted voice broke through, faint but unmistakable. "Leave, while you can." I didn't need to be told twice. Grabbing my belongings, I bolted out of the control room and headed for the station's main exit. But as I reached the door, I stopped in my tracks. The clock in the waiting room, which had inexplicably moved the previous night, now read 3:33. Suddenly, a deafening noise filled the air, the screech of metal on metal, like a train braking violently. I spun around to see lights flickering on Platform 3. A train was arriving. But that was impossible. No trains had run through Ravenmore in years. Against my better judgment, I crept toward the platform. The screeching grew louder, accompanied by the rhythmic clatter of wheels on tracks. When I reached the edge, the train came into view. It was unlike any train I'd ever seen. The carriages were blackened and corroded, with windows so dark they seemed to absorb the light. The engine hissed and groaned, expelling clouds of steam that smelled of decay. The doors slid open, revealing nothing but pitch darkness inside. And then, one by one, the figures from the CCTV stepped onto the platform. They moved slowly, their footsteps echoing unnaturally, as though time itself had warped around them. I backed away, my flashlight shaking in my hand. That's when I felt it, a hand on my shoulder. Whipping around, I came face to face with the woman from the ticket booth. She was inches away, her hollow eyes locking onto mine. "You shouldn't have come back," she whispered. Before I could react, she stepped onto the train, joining the others. The doors closed with a bone-chilling hiss, and the train began to move. As it disappeared into the darkness, the station fell silent once more. But the silence wasn't comforting. It was the kind of silence that held 1,000 untold stories, each more horrifying than the last. I didn't sleep that morning. I couldn't. All I could think about was the woman's final words and the feeling that Ravenmore wasn't finished with me yet. The next night I found myself standing at the entrance of Ravenmore train station once again, this time with a mix of dread and resolve. I didn't want to come back, but something deep inside whispered that I had no choice. It felt as though the station had latched onto me, pulling me into its web of shadows and secrets. As I stepped inside, the air was heavier than ever, charged with a tension that made my skin crawl. The station felt different tonight. Alive, almost. The walls seemed to pulse faintly, and the ever-present mist outside the windows swirled unnaturally, as if it had a mind of its own. I returned to the control room and switched on the CCTV monitors. At first they showed the same desolate platforms and waiting area, but then the grainy images began to distort. The screen flickered, and for a brief moment, I saw something impossible. The station was bustling with life. Crowds of people moved through the platforms, their faces obscured, but their movements hurried and purposeful. The grand clock in the waiting room ticked steadily, its hands pointing to 11:59. Steam billowed from a train that had just arrived, its whistle piercing through the monitor's static. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the vision was gone, replaced by the empty, decayed station I knew too well. I couldn't ignore it anymore. This place was holding on to something it desperately wanted me to see. Gathering what little courage I had left, I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the waiting room. When I entered, the room felt colder than ever, and the clock on the wall now read 3:47. As I stood there trying to make sense of everything, a low, rumbling noise began to fill the station. It was faint at first, but it grew louder and louder until it sounded like a freight train barreling through. But there was no train. Instead, the ground beneath me seemed to shift, and the air grew thick with the stench of smoke and charred wood. Shadows began to form along the walls, twisting and writhing as if they were alive. And then I saw it, a vision so vivid it felt like I was living it. I was no longer in the present-day Ravenmore. The station was alive again, bustling with passengers, but the atmosphere was tense, almost panicked. People shouted, and the sound of a distant explosion echoed through the air. I realized this wasn't just a vision, it was a memory, a fragment of the station's tragic past. Ravenmore had been the site of a catastrophic accident decades ago. A train, overloaded with passengers, had derailed on the outskirts of the station, causing a massive fire that consumed the carriages. Many had died, their bodies trapped in the inferno, unable to escape. The survivors spoke of strange occurrences afterward, ghostly figures, whispers in the dark, and the feeling of being watched. The station had been closed shortly after, but it seemed the souls lost that night had never left. The vision faded, and I found myself back in the cold, decaying station. But I wasn't alone. Standing in the center of the room was the woman from the night before, her wet clothes clinging to her frail frame. "You saw it, didn't you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I nodded, unable to speak. "They keep coming back," she continued, her hollow eyes staring into mine, waiting for a train that will never arrive. "They're trapped here, bound by the tragedy that claimed their lives. And now, so are you." Her words sent a chill down my spine. I stepped back, shaking my head in denial. "No," I said, my voice trembling. "I don't belong here." She tilted her head, a sad smile spreading across her pale face. "You do now. Once Ravenmore claims you, it doesn't let go." Before I could respond, the station was plunged into darkness. The lanterns flickered out, and the air grew still. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then I heard the whistle. The ghostly train was coming back. I ran, my footsteps echoing through the empty station as the sound of the approaching train grew louder. I didn't stop until I reached the main entrance, throwing open the doors and stumbling into the cold night air. But
as I turned to look back, I saw them. The figures from the platforms now standing just inside the station, their hollow eyes watching me. The woman stood among them, her sad smile the last thing I saw before the doors closed on their own, locking me out.
I never returned to Ravenmore after that night. I quit the job and moved far away, hoping to leave the nightmares behind. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the faint sound of a train whistle in the distance, accompanied by the echoes of hollow footsteps. Ravenmore isn't just a station, it's a tomb, a prison for the lost souls of that tragic night, and a reminder that some places are better left undisturbed.